The room went completely silent when the billionaire CEO asked the one question nobody expected. "Why are you the only person here who isn't trying to impress me?" Dozens of people froze around the long marble table, their smiles suddenly looking forced, their expensive suits suddenly feeling like costumes. Everyone in the room had spent the entire morning praising the woman at the head of the table, telling her how brilliant she was, how elegant she looked, how lucky the company was to have her. But one man had said almost nothing. He sat near the end of the conference table in a faded gray shirt, his old leather shoes polished carefully but showing years of wear. His name was Rayan Mercer, a quiet single father who had come to the company hoping to secure a small maintenance contract that could keep his little daughter in school. He had no idea that by refusing to flatter the most powerful woman in the building, he was about to change both of their lives. Before we continue, if you believe that kindness, honesty, and second chances can change someone's life, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Hardworking Dad. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the people we overlook are the ones carrying the biggest hearts. The meeting was being held in the sunlit headquarters of Avellini Industries, a glass and steel tower where everything seemed designed to make ordinary people feel small. On the 42nd floor, sunlight poured through enormous windows and reflected across a polished table surrounded by executives who had spent years learning how to survive around wealth. At the center sat Seraphina Vale, the 34-year-old billionaire CEO who had inherited a struggling company and turned it into one of the fastest-growing technology firms in the country. She was admired, feared, photographed, and constantly surrounded by people who wanted something from her. That morning, her executives had been competing to praise her. One called her the greatest business mind of her generation. Another told her that her leadership was inspiring enough to change the industry. Someone else laughed loudly at a joke that wasn't funny. Seraphina listened with a practiced smile, but inside she felt exhausted. She had begun to wonder whether anyone in her life actually liked her or whether everyone simply liked what her name could give them. Rayan sat quietly at the end of the table because he had no reason to pretend. He wasn't there to become friends with a billionaire. He wasn't looking for a promotion, an invitation, or a favor. He was there because his daughter, Mira, had handed him a drawing that morning before he left home. It showed the two of them standing beneath a yellow sun, holding hands beside a tiny house. Underneath it, in crooked handwriting, she had written, "Daddy, don't give up." Rayan had folded the drawing carefully and placed it inside his wallet. His wife had died 3 years earlier after a sudden illness, leaving him to raise Mira alone. Since then, he had worked whatever jobs he could find, often leaving before sunrise and returning after his daughter had fallen asleep. He had learned that pride didn't pay rent, but neither did begging. So when the company announced it needed a contractor for building maintenance, he spent weeks preparing his proposal. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and honest work had carried him and his daughter through some very dark years. When Seraphina asked the room why nobody had challenged the projected budget, everyone suddenly looked at one another. Rayan raised his hand. The executive stared at him as though he had broken an unwritten rule. Seraphina nodded toward him. Rayan calmly explained that the budget was too high and that several of the proposed expenses were unnecessary. He didn't say it to impress her. In fact, he barely looked at her while speaking. He pointed out that a cheaper local supplier could provide the same materials and that the company was spending thousands more than necessary simply because nobody had questioned the existing contract. The room became uncomfortable. One executive laughed nervously and said Rayan clearly didn't understand how a billion-dollar company operated. Rayan simply replied that perhaps he didn't, but he did understand how it felt to count every dollar before buying groceries. Something changed in Seraphina's expression. For the first time that morning, she looked genuinely interested. After the meeting ended, the executives gathered around Seraphina again, offering compliments and excuses. Rayan quietly packed his papers and prepared to leave. He was already calculating how he would explain to Mira that the contract had probably gone to someone else. As he reached the elevator, Seraphina's voice stopped him. She asked why he had been so honest when everyone else had spent the morning telling her exactly what they thought she wanted to hear. Rayan looked at her and said that his daughter had taught him something after her mother died. When you lose someone you love, you realize how little time you actually have to waste pretending. He said he didn't know anything about being a billionaire, but he knew that a person deserved the truth even when the truth wasn't comfortable. Seraphina stood there quietly. She had received hundreds of compliments that week, but that simple answer stayed with her longer than all of them. Later that afternoon, she learned more about Rayan. The company investigator reported that he had no criminal record, no unpaid debts, and no history of dishonesty. His small maintenance business was barely surviving, but his clients consistently described him as dependable. One former client mentioned that when a local elderly couple couldn't afford a repair, Rayan had fixed their heating system for free. Another said he had once stayed overnight at a community center because the children there had no working water heater. Seraphina stared at the report for a long time. She was used to seeing people measured by profit margins, assets, and connections. Rayan's value seemed to exist somewhere outside all those numbers. The next morning, Seraphina unexpectedly visited the building where Rayan worked. She found him in a storage room repairing a broken ventilation unit while speaking to Mira on the phone during his lunch break. He didn't know Seraphina was standing nearby. His entire face changed when he talked to his daughter. The intimidating seriousness he had shown in the boardroom disappeared, replaced by warmth. He asked Mira if she had eaten, reminded her to finish her homework, and promised that he would be home before dinner. When the call ended, he turned and nearly dropped the screwdriver in his hand. Seraphina smiled and told him she had come to offer him the contract. Rayan was stunned. But then she added something he hadn't expected. She wanted him to become the company's facilities manager, not because she felt sorry for him, but because she believed he was the first person in the building who had cared more about doing the right thing than getting ahead. Rayan hesitated. He was afraid of entering a world he didn't understand. He was afraid people would think he had been given the position because of pity. Most of all, he was afraid of failing his daughter. Seraphina told him that sometimes the people who fear failure the most are the people who take responsibility the most seriously. Weeks passed, and Rayan began changing the company from the inside. He didn't become arrogant. He didn't suddenly start wearing expensive suits. He still packed Mira's lunch every morning and still drove an old car that rattled whenever he turned too sharply. But employees began noticing something different. He remembered people's names. He listened when cleaners complained about broken equipment. He made sure the night staff received proper breaks. He noticed when someone was working through lunch. He treated the security guards with the same respect he gave executives. And slowly, Seraphina began spending more time around him. At first, she told herself it was because he was useful. Then she told herself it was because she admired his character. But one afternoon, while they were walking through the company's courtyard beneath a bright summer sky, Seraphina realized she had begun looking forward to seeing him. Not the employee. Not the father. Not the man who had challenged her budget. Rayan himself. She asked him if he ever went out, and he laughed. He said that between work, school pickups, grocery shopping, homework, and trying to keep a 7-year-old from turning the living room into an art studio, dating had not exactly been a priority. Seraphina smiled and said she understood. Then, after a moment of hesitation, she surprised even herself. She asked him on a date. Rayan stared at her as though she had spoken another language. He reminded her that she was a billionaire CEO and he was just a maintenance manager and single father. Seraphina shook her head. She said she wasn't asking him to attend a business dinner. She was asking him to spend one ordinary afternoon with her. Their first date wasn't at a luxury restaurant. Seraphina deliberately chose a small outdoor cafe where nobody would recognize her. They sat beneath a striped umbrella while sunlight moved across the tables. Rayan ordered coffee. Seraphina ordered tea. They talked for hours about ordinary things. She told him about growing up surrounded by wealth but feeling lonely in crowded rooms. He told her about Mira's obsession with drawing suns in every picture because her mother had once told her that even the darkest day still had a sunrise. For the first time in years, Seraphina laughed without worrying about how she looked. But just when their lives seemed to be moving towards something beautiful, trouble arrived. A photograph of them leaving the cafe appeared online the next morning. Headlines accused Rayan of manipulating the billionaire CEO. Some claimed he had deliberately pursued her for money. Others called him a gold digger. The company's board demanded that Seraphina end the relationship immediately. They warned her that her reputation was at risk and that Rayan could damage the company. Rayan saw the headlines before Seraphina could call him. That evening, he packed his things at work and left a resignation letter on her desk. When Seraphina found it, she rushed downstairs and saw him standing outside the building with his worn leather bag over his shoulder. He told her he couldn't allow his daughter to become the target of strangers because of him. He said he had spent his whole life trying to give Mira one thing her mother would have wanted for her, a peaceful life. He couldn't trade that peace for a relationship, no matter how much he cared about Seraphina. Seraphina's eyes filled with tears. She asked whether he was leaving because he didn't love her. Rayan looked at her and said that was exactly why he was leaving. He loved her enough not to let her lose herself defending him. For a moment, Seraphina said nothing. Then she remembered what he had told her on the first day: when you lose someone you love, you realize how little time you have to waste pretending. She stepped closer and told him she was tired of living according to what everyone else expected. She had spent her entire life surrounded by people who wanted her money, her influence, and her approval. Rayan was the first person who had given her the truth even when it cost him something. She refused to lose the one person who had made her feel like she could finally be herself. The next morning, Seraphina walked into the board meeting and announced that Rayan would not be fired. She also announced that the company would establish a family support program for employees raising children alone. She said the company had spent millions protecting its image but had forgotten that real people were the reason the company existed. Months later, Rayan and Mira moved into a modest home with a little garden. Seraphina visited often, and Mira quickly decided that the billionaire CEO was simply the lady who brings too many books. Their relationship didn't become a fairy tale overnight. They still had disagreements, difficult days, and moments when fear returned. But they had something more valuable than a perfect life: honesty. One bright Saturday afternoon, Seraphina sat in the garden while Mira drew another picture. Rayan was fixing a wooden fence nearby. Mira eventually handed Seraphina the drawing. It showed 3 people standing beneath a huge yellow sun. Seraphina looked at it and smiled. She asked who the 3 people were. Mira simply said, "Us." Seraphina looked across the garden at Rayan, who was pretending not to listen. The billionaire CEO who once had everything but felt alone had finally discovered something money could never buy. And the single father who thought he was only fighting to give his daughter a better future had unknowingly given someone else a second chance at happiness. Sometimes life doesn't send us what we expect. Sometimes it sends us someone who challenges us, humbles us, and reminds us that a person's worth isn't measured by the clothes they wear, the car they drive, or the size of their bank account. Sometimes the greatest love begins with something as simple as telling the truth when everyone else is afraid to. If this story touched your heart, please don't just watch and move on. Like the video, share it with someone who believes good people still exist, and subscribe to Hardworking Dad so we can continue bringing you stories about courage, kindness, family, and second chances. And before the story ends, comment "second chances" if you believe one honest person can change another person's life. Because sometimes, the person who refuses to flatter you is the person who sees you most clearly. And sometimes, the heart you almost overlook is the heart that was meant to stay.